Hi, I am Lauren Rudgerson, and this is my video presentation of assignment number 5 for Chapter 20 in American Yop. We covered the Progressive Era. After the Industrial Revolution, this chapter covers kind of what laws changed and how society changed, who felt they had a voice, and all of that during the Progressive Era. With the Industrial Revolution and the change in the corporate landscape, there was need for regulations in all these new industries that had developed, as well as laws in place to help protect the laborers. Conditions were very poor in a lot of these labor houses in the steel industry and the rail industry, and like them, even the meatpacking industry, which we'll discuss. One of the big stories that they discuss early on in the chapter was the Triangle Waist shirt fire, where there were previously protests to the unsafe working conditions that went ignored and often punished. Women worked in this workhouse and were often locked inside and prevented from taking breaks to maximize efficiency and the amount of time, the work that they could do in the time that they were there. The hours were very long. It was often dangerous with the flammable materials that they were working with, and inevitably a fire broke out. 146 people ended up losing their lives in this fire. It was traumatizing to everybody in the area as women jumped to their deaths from the top of the 10-story building that they were working in. And it helped bring about change in regulations and how the safety of these workhouses was viewed. Women in the day were also fighting for their own equal rights. They were not permitted to vote, even though they were in working situations. They were coming out of the homes, working in factories, having more active roles in professional careers, striving for education, advances in education and access to education. They were working in healthcare industries, and, they rightfully sought equal representation by law. They looked for, the right to vote as one of the big, changes that could be made. It was fought state by state until, women banded together and made it a bigger legal fight by ratifying the 19th Amendment. Susan B. Anthony was a large active player on that front. She didn't get to see the ratification of the 19th Amendment, the one that prevented women from voting based on their gender, but she was one of the first to start that fight, and we owe a lot to her for that. Even with the access of women to the right to vote, it was not shared equally among races. African Americans were often intimidated and bullied and, stopped from voting in southern states. Jim Crow laws were still in place, and this made living in the South really hostile and unattainable for the African American population. This spurred a great migration, is what it was called, where a lot of African Americans moved north and started populating northern states and cities, and it changed the landscape once again as different cities grew and rural populations grew and changed. They established the NAACP during this era, and in the northern states they were able to really start pushing for the fight for equal rights for African Americans. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the big players for this. He is one of the founders of the NAACP. He was often critical of other African Americans of the time trying to fight for rights, but not too many rights. He, went full on with what he looked for and gave no quarter. He thought that allowing anything like segregation to continue or to be put into place was a step backwards for progress. They talked about the meat packing industry, which I really thought was great, because I remember reading The Jungle. I think I mentioned it before in one of my previous papers, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. His book brought about changes in the meat packing and food safety industry with the establishment of the USDA. the U.S. Department of Agriculture, they started regulating foods and how they were processed, working conditions, and trying to make them safer for consumers. Try not to make this video too long, but legal changes were some of the biggest things that came about in the progressive era. Several amendments were ratified. We discussed the 19th. The 17th was another one. This made it so the senators were voted for by citizens of the states that they were choosing to represent or trying to represent, as opposed to being voted by higher state legislation. It was a very informative chapter, and there was, equality was not spread equally. It was a fight. Some steps backwards were made, some steps forwards were made, but ultimately it continued the progress of America as a country and the development of democracy. So that's all I have for chapter 20 from American Yop on the progressive era. Thank you.